Mont Blanc ink weighed heavy between Evelyn Caldwell's fingers. Outside her Chicago high-rise, violent thunder battered glass, providing dark backdrops for corporate ruin. Her shipping empire, once valued at billions, drowned inexplicably in $1.2 billion of phantom debt. Chapter 11. Bankruptcy documents lay before her, crisp, white, final. Her CFO urged surrender. Impatient lawyers tapped luxury watches. She lowered her gold nib to sign, ready to forfeit her legacy, until one unexpected voice shattered boardroom silence. It came from someone emptying shredders. "Wait," whispered that trembling janitor. "You missed this number." The air inside the executive boardroom of Caldwell Maritime and Logistics was meticulously climate controlled, yet Evelyn Caldwell felt as though she were suffocating. At 34, Evelyn was one of the youngest female billionaire CEOs in North America. She had inherited the logistics conglomerate from her grandfather, building it from a formidable North Atlantic fleet into a global supply chain leviathan. She was known for her razor-sharp intellect, her immaculate tailored Tom Ford suits, and her unwavering composure under pressure. But today, there was no composure, only the ashes of her family's legacy. Spread across the sprawling, custom-built mahogany table were 300 pages of legal ruin. It was the Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing, heavily annotated by the senior partners at Kirkland & Ellis, the prestigious restructuring law firm she had hired to salvage whatever scraps remained. For the past 8 months, Caldwell Maritime had been bleeding cash. It started as a trickle, a missed earnings projection here, a spiked fuel cost there, but it had rapidly escalated into a torrential hemorrhage. Their primary liquid assets had evaporated. Their credit lines with Chase and Goldman Sachs were frozen. Evelyn stared blindly at the text. Fiduciary duty, liquidation of assets, severance, restructuring. Words that meant 40,000 people were about to lose their livelihoods because she had failed. Evelyn, a soft, carefully modulated voice, broke her reverie. It was Grayson Langdon, her chief financial officer. Grayson was a veteran of the corporate world, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and an impeccable reputation on Wall Street. He had been her grandfather's protege, the man who had guided her through her first rocky years as CEO. "I know how hard this is," Grayson said, placing a comforting paternal hand on her shoulder. His voice dripped with practiced empathy. "But we have exhausted every avenue. The European market contraction, the surge in Brent crude prices, the unexpected tariffs. It was a perfect storm. No one blames you. But if you don't sign this today, before the market opens in New York, the creditors will force us into Chapter 7 and blazing. We won't just restructure, we will be liquidated, sold off for parts." William Bradley, the lead restructuring attorney from Kirkland & Ellis, cleared his throat. He was a shark in a pinstripe suit, entirely detached from the emotional gravity of the room. "Mr. Langdon is correct, Miss Caldwell. The grace period expired at midnight. The judge is waiting on the electronic filing. If we delay, the board holds you personally liable for the breach of fiduciary duty. We need your signature." Evelyn closed her eyes, fighting the aggressive sting of tears. She was not a woman who cried, especially not in front of men who billed by the minute. She thought of the shipyards in Virginia, the dock workers in Rotterdam, the logistics coordinators in Seattle. All of them trusted her. All of them were about to be blindsided. "How did we not see the deficit until it was $1 billion, Grayson?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, thick with exhaustion. She hadn't slept in 3 days. "Our internal audits were flawless. Ernst & Young gave us a clean bill of health 2 quarters ago. How does $1 billion of operational capital just vanish into thin air?" Grayson sighed, adjusting his silk tie. "Complex supply chains, Evelyn. The localized subsidiaries in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia were shielding their losses to meet their quarterly targets. By the time the consolidated reports hit my desk, the damage was terminal. It's a systemic failure, tragic, but out of our hands." She looked at him. Something in his eyes, a fleeting, almost imperceptible gleam of impatience, bothered her. But her mind was too clouded by grief and sleep deprivation to analyze it. She was defeated. The math didn't lie. The accounts were empty. Evelyn picked up the Mont Blanc pen. The gold felt heavy, cold, and alien. She uncapped it, staring at the little black line labeled Chief Executive Officer. She hovered the pen over the paper. The silence in the room was absolute. save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the building's massive HVAC system and the soft rustle of a trash bag in the far corner of the room. Arthur Hayes was entirely invisible, and he preferred it that way. At 42, Arthur wore the slate gray uniform of Horizon Facility Services, a third-party commercial cleaning contractor. He had a mop bucket on wheels, a utility belt heavy with glass cleaner and rags, and a crushing, suffocating mountain of debt. Arthur wasn't always invisible. 5 years ago, he was a senior actuary at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. He wore a suit, carried a leather briefcase, and analyzed complex risk models for Fortune 500 companies. He had a house in the suburbs, a beautiful wife named Sarah, and a bright-eyed toddler named Leo. Then the universe rolled the dice, and Arthur lost everything. Sarah died suddenly from a ruptured brain aneurysm. 6 months later, little Leo was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The American healthcare system, with its labyrinth of deductibles, out-of-network specialists, and experimental treatments, swiftly dismantled Arthur's comfortable middle-class life. He missed too many days at PwC sitting by his son's hospital bed. He was quietly let go. The medical bills piled up, devouring his savings, his 401k, and eventually, his house. Now, they lived in a cramped, drafty, two-bedroom apartment. Leo was in remission, thank God, but the maintenance medications and the lingering million-dollar medical debt meant Arthur had to take whatever work he could get that allowed him to be with his son during the day. So, he cleaned the glass castles of the wealthy at night. Tonight, his shift had been brutal. The Caldwell Maritime Executive Suite was a mess of half-eaten catered meals, overflowing recycling bins, and discarded legal pads. The executives had been pulling all-nighters. Arthur had clocked in at 10 p.m. and was supposed to be off by 6 a.m., but his supervisor had threatened to dock his pay if the boardroom wasn't spotless for the big meeting at 7 a.m. At 6:15 a.m., while wiping down the massive, frosted, smart glass walls that served as projection screens for Caldwell's financial data, Arthur had paused. The executives had left the master financial ledger projected on the glass, a complex lattice of spreadsheets detailing the company's operating expenses for the past fiscal year. To the cleaning staff, it was just a wall of boring, glowing numbers. But to Arthur's deeply ingrained actuarial brain, it was a language he read fluently. He leaned on his squeegee, his eyes scanning the columns. It was a habit he couldn't break. He liked the order of math. Math never lied. Math never got sick. But as his eyes traced a specific column under the heading Global Fleet Operating Expenses, Caribbean Division, his brow furrowed. Something was wrong. Violently wrong. He stepped closer to the glass, ignoring the smudge he had just made. The ledger detailed bunker fuel surcharges for a fleet of 20 Panamax-class cargo ships operating out of Nassau. The expenses were astronomical, accounting for nearly $400 million of the company's deficit. Arthur pulled a crumpled notepad from his back pocket, the one he used to track Leo's medication schedules, and did some quick mental arithmetic, jotting down a few figures. The ledger claimed these ships were consuming maximum fuel allotments while navigating high seas routes between South America and Europe. But Arthur's eyes darted to the adjacent logistical column, which listed dry dock maintenance windows. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Vessel, 402. Fuel expense, $8.5 million for Q3. Status in Q3, dry docked in Freeport for retrofitting. Vessel, 406. Fuel expense, $9.2 million for Q3. Status in Q3, dry docked in Port of Spain. They're charging fuel to parked ships, Arthur whispered to himself, the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He kept scanning. 12 of the 20 ships racking up massive fuel expenses had been out of commission for maintenance. You don't burn bunker fuel when a ship is sitting on blocks having its hull scraped. Arthur looked at the routing numbers for the payments. They weren't going to standard fuel suppliers like Exxon or Shell. The hundreds of millions of dollars were being funneled into a vendor called Nassau Maritime Logistics, LLC. It wasn't a market failure. It wasn't a complex supply chain breakdown. It was a ghost company. Someone internally was authorizing payments for phantom fuel and funneling the cash into an offshore shell account. It was textbook embezzlement executed on a staggering billion-dollar scale. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the clock. 6:45 a.m. The executives were starting to arrive. He needed to leave. If he was caught analyzing their proprietary financial data, he wouldn't just be fired. He could be arrested for corporate espionage. He needed this job. He needed the health insurance for Leo's upcoming bone marrow biopsy. He aggressively wiped the smudge off the glass, threw his supplies into the cart, and wheeled it toward the door. "Just keep your head down," he told himself. "Let the billionaires lose their money. It's not your problem." But as he pushed his cart into the corner of the room to grab the final bag of shredded paper, the massive oak doors opened. In walked Evelyn Caldwell, looking like a ghost of a woman, flanked by Grayson Langdon and a swarm of lawyers. Arthur was trapped. He shrank back into the corner alcove, pretending to obsessively organize the recycling bins, hoping they would ignore the man in the gray uniform. For 20 tense minutes, he listened to the agonizing conversation. He heard the CFO blame the European market. He heard the lawyer demand the signature. He heard the sheer devastating grief in Evelyn Caldwell's voice as she asked how $1 billion could just vanish. "I know how," Arthur thought, his hands gripping the edge of the plastic trash barrel so hard his knuckles turned white. "I know exactly how." He watched Evelyn uncap the pen. He thought of his own despair when the hospital billing department handed him a piece of paper that told him his life was over. He saw that same hollow, terrified look in the billionaire's eyes. Before his brain could calculate the risk, his conscience hijacked his mouth. Wait. The single syllable fell into the silent boardroom like a live grenade. William Bradley, the lawyer, whipped his head around, adjusting his glasses, as if trying to bring an alien life form into focus. Grayson Langdon froze, his posture stiffening defensively. Evelyn's hand stopped, the gold nib of the pen a millimeter above the signature line. She turned slowly, her sharp blue eyes finding the man in the corner. Arthur stepped out of the shadows of the alcove. He felt completely ridiculous. He was wearing scuffed steel-toed boots, a gray uniform stained with industrial bleach, and holding a half-empty bag of shredded documents. He looked at the most powerful executives in Chicago and swallowed hard. "Excuse me?" William Bradley snapped, his voice lashing out like a whip. "Who the hell are you? Security!" "Don't sign it," Arthur said, his voice shaking initially, but gaining a strange, resolute strength as he stepped closer to the magnificent mahogany table. "You missed a number, a really big one." "Get this man out of here immediately," Grayson Langdon barked, his face flushing a sudden deep crimson. He lunged toward the table intercom to page the security desk. "This is a confidential legal proceeding. You are trespassing." "Stop." Evelyn's voice was not loud, but it carried absolute authority. It was the voice of a woman who commanded fleets of steel across oceans. Langdon's hand hovered over the intercom button. Bradley closed his mouth. Evelyn stared at Arthur. She didn't look at his uniform or his mop cart. She looked directly into his eyes. She saw the heavy bags under them, the exhaustion, but also a sharp, undeniable intelligence. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone icy but curious. "My name is Arthur Hayes. I work for Horizon Facility Services," Arthur said, standing straight. "But before that, I was a senior actuary at PwC. I specialized in forensic risk assessment for maritime logistics." Langdon let out a harsh, mocking bark of laughter. A janitor who used to be an actuary. How poetic. "Evelyn, please, the court is waiting." The man is clearly deranged. He probably glanced at a spreadsheet and thinks he's cracked the Da Vinci Code. "Let him speak," Evelyn commanded, never breaking eye contact with Arthur. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Mr. Hayes. What number did I miss?" Arthur walked past the furious lawyers and approached the smart glass wall. He picked up a dry erase marker resting on the ledge. "Your CFO," Arthur said, pointing the marker directly at Langdon, "told you that your deficit was caused by market contraction and localized subsidiary losses. That's a lie." "Defamation!" Langdon roared, taking a step toward Arthur. "Evelyn, I will not stand here and be insulted by the help." 50 seconds, Mr. Hayes," Evelyn said calmly, though her pulse had begun to race. Arthur turned to the glass, tapped the control panel to wake the screen, and pulled up the master ledger he had been studying. He circled the heading, Global Fleet Operating Expenses, Caribbean Division. "Look at this column," Arthur instructed, his voice slipping effortlessly into the confident cadence of a corporate presenter. "This details the bunker fuel surcharges for your Panamax fleet in the Caribbean. Specifically, vessels 401 through 420. The total expenditure for the last 3 quarters is approximately $420 million. Fuel prices are at a record high," Bradley interjected impatiently. "We know this. It's a major factor in the bankruptcy." "Yes, fuel is expensive," Arthur countered, "but it only costs money if you actually burn it." He rapidly navigated the touchscreen, pulling up the parallel logistical manifest. He drew a hard red line connecting vessel 402's fuel expense to its logistical status. Vessel 402 billed $8.5 million in fuel consumption for Q3. But according to your own dry dock maintenance logs, Vessel 402 spent the entirety of Q3 sitting on blocks in Freeport, getting its hull retrofitted. It didn't burn a single drop of diesel. The room went dead silent. Only the rain drumming against the glass could be heard. Arthur didn't stop. He drew another red line. Vessel 406, $9.2 million in fuel. Status: dry docked in Port of Spain. Vessel 411, $7 million. Status: impounded for customs review in Kingston. He turned back to the table, locking eyes with Evelyn. 12 of the 20 ships in this fleet have been out of the water for the better part of a year. Yet, they are billing maximum capacity fuel consumption. And if you look at the routing numbers, Arthur tapped the screen one last time, highlighting the vendor. Every single cent of that $420 million was paid to a vendor called Nassau Maritime Logistics, LLC. Evelyn slowly stood up from her chair. The Chapter 11 documents fluttered slightly as she moved. She walked over to the glass, her eyes darting between the fuel expenditures and the maintenance logs. The math was elementary once someone pointed it out. It was so glaringly obvious that it could only have been hidden by someone who controlled both sets of books and authorized the audits. She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto Grayson Langdon. The warmth and panic had completely drained from her face, replaced by a terrifying, predatory calm. "Grayson," she whispered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "What is Nassau Maritime Logistics, LLC?" Langdon's face had lost all its color. The silver-haired executive looked suddenly small, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. "Evelyn, it's a standard fuel routing subsidiary. The logs must be a clerical error from the Caribbean office. A systemic glitch." "A $400 million glitch on parked ships," Arthur interjected dryly. "I ran the corporate registry on my phone while I was emptying the trash." Nassau Maritime Logistics, LLC isn't a fuel supplier. It's a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. It was incorporated 14 months ago, exactly when your cash flow issues began. "Shut up!" Langdon screamed at Arthur, completely losing his corporate veneer. "You know nothing! You're a glorified maid!" "William," Evelyn said, not taking her eyes off Langdon. The lawyer snapped to attention. "Yes, Miss Caldwell?" "Call the FBI, the white-collar crime division, then call the bankruptcy judge and withdraw our filing." "Evelyn! Wait! Be reasonable!" Langdon pleaded, stepping toward her, his hands raised in surrender. "We can fix this. Let's just talk in private." "If you take one more step toward me, Grayson, I will throw you out of this window myself," Evelyn said, her voice laced with venom. She turned back to Arthur, who was standing quietly by the glass wall, still holding his dry erase marker. The billionaire and the janitor stared at each other amidst the wreckage of the boardroom. "Mr. Hayes," Evelyn said, her breathing heavy, the realization of what had just happened washing over her. He had just saved her company. He had just saved 40,000 jobs. She looked at his stained uniform and then down at the master ledger he had so effortlessly decoded. "You said you were an actuary. Why are you wearing a Horizon facility uniform?" Arthur looked down at his boots, the adrenaline fading, replaced by the heavy exhaustion of his reality. "My son, Leo, got sick. Leukemia. I missed too much work, lost my job, lost my insurance. The medical debt wiped me out. I clean buildings at night so I can take him to chemotherapy during the day." Evelyn Caldwell stared at him. For the first time in months, the crushing weight on her chest lifted, replaced by a fierce, burning clarity. She looked at the bankruptcy papers on the table, picked them up, and slowly, deliberately, ripped them in half. "Mr. Hayes," Evelyn said, a genuine, powerful smile breaking across her face for the first time in a year. "I think you just cleaned your last floor." The immediate aftermath in the Caldwell Maritime boardroom was absolute chaos. A beautiful, vindicating kind of destruction. William Bradley, the Kirkland and Ellis attorney who had spent the last week treating Evelyn like a naive heiress, was now frantically dialing the federal courthouse, his hands slick with sweat. Grayson Langdon was pinned against the mahogany wall by two heavy-set corporate security guards, his previously immaculate silver hair disheveled, his silk tie hanging crookedly. He was babbling incoherently about misunderstandings and offshore tax strategies, but nobody was listening. Evelyn Caldwell did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply watched Grayson with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing a dying insect. "Take him down to the underground garage," Evelyn instructed the security chief. Keep him in holding room B until the FBI arrives. If he tries to use his phone, break it. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the disgraced CFO, the deafening silence returned to the room. Evelyn turned her attention back to Arthur Hayes. The man was still standing by his yellow mop bucket, looking entirely overwhelmed by the hurricane he had just unleashed. "Mr. Hayes," Evelyn said, walking toward him. The sharp clicking of her Christian Dior heels echoed on the hardwood floor. "How much is your son's treatment?" Arthur blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in focus. "Excuse me?" "The leukemia, the bone marrow biopsy, the treatments," Evelyn clarified, her voice softening just a fraction. "How much is the debt, and how much do you need for his immediate care?" Arthur looked down at his scuffed, steel-toed boots. The lingering debt from his induction chemo is around $300,000. The bone marrow transplant, they want him at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. The out-of-pocket costs, the relocation, the specialized post-op care, it's pushing $500,000. It's money that doesn't exist, Miss Caldwell. That's why I'm cleaning your floors. Evelyn walked over to the massive conference table, grabbed a blank legal pad, and pulled a slim, black checkbook from her leather portfolio. She wrote rapidly, the stroke of her pen aggressive and precise. She tore the slip of paper free and held it out to Arthur. Arthur hesitated, then wiped his hands on his gray uniform trousers before taking it. He stared at the numbers. Ibai Mayern. His breath hitched. He looked up, his eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. "Miss Caldwell, I can't take this. I just pointed out a spreadsheet error. I'm not a charity case." "That is not charity, Arthur," Evelyn said, her tone broke. "No argument. That is a signing bonus. You saved my family's legacy from being sold off for parts. But more importantly, you possess a forensic analytical capability that my $4 million a year accounting firm entirely missed. I don't need a janitor. I need a chief risk officer who understands how desperate men hide money." She stepped closer, pointing at the smart glass wall where the damning financial data still glowed. Grayson Langdon did not act alone. A $400 million embezzlement scheme involving 20 cargo ships, forged dry dock manifests, and offshore Cayman accounts requires an infrastructure he does not possess. Someone helped him. Someone with immense resources. I want to know who is trying to bleed me dry, and I want you to find them. Arthur looked at the check, then at the glowing numbers on the glass. The actuary inside him, the man who loved puzzles, who had been dormant for 5 years beneath a mountain of grief and medical bills stirred, he thought of little Leo, sleeping in a drafty apartment. He thought of the world-class oncologists at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He slowly folded the check and slid it into his breast pocket. "When do I start?" "Right now," Evelyn said. "Leave them up." Over the next 72 hours, the executive suite of Caldwell Maritime was transformed into a war room. Evelyn commandeered the entire 50th floor. Arthur was given a corner office, 3 high-speed workstations, and unlimited access to the company's deepest server mainframes. He didn't sleep. Fueled by endless cups of black coffee and the raw adrenaline of his sudden resurrection, Arthur hunted. He bypassed the sanitized internal audits and dug directly into the SWIFT transaction codes. He tracked the wire transfers sent to Nassau Maritime Logistics LLC. It was a labyrinthine process. The money didn't just sit in the Cayman Islands. It was immediately fractalized, broken down into hundreds of smaller transactions, and bounced through shell companies in Cyprus, the Isle of Man, and Belize. It was a technique known as smurfing, designed to defeat automated banking flags. But Arthur wasn't a machine. He was a desperate father with a savant-level grasp of probability and risk deviation. He began looking for the one thing criminals always fail to hide, the convergence point. Money, no matter how scattered, eventually has to come home to the master. On the evening of the 3rd day, as a bruised purple twilight settled over Chicago, Arthur burst into Evelyn's office. He didn't knock. Evelyn was on the phone with a federal prosecutor, her face pale with exhaustion. She held up a finger, finished the call, and hung up. "Tell me you have something, Arthur." "The board of directors is panicking. The press got wind of the withdrawn bankruptcy, and our stock is plummeting. They think I've lost my mind." Arthur dropped a thick, leather-bound dossier onto her desk. "I found the convergence point." Evelyn leaned forward, opening the folder. Inside were reams of banking logs, highlighted in bright yellow, mapping a complex web of international wire transfers. The money that went into Nassau Maritime Logistics was routed through 14 different countries, Arthur explained, his voice hoarse. But 70% of it was eventually consolidated into a private wealth management account at Deutsche Bank in Zurich. I managed to cross-reference the routing numbers of that specific Swiss account with corporate dividend payouts. He reached out and tapped a single name at the bottom of the page. The beneficiary of the Zurich account is a holding company called Apex Horizon Holdings, and the sole proprietor of Apex Horizon is Thomas Sterling. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She stared at the name, the letters burning into her retinas. Thomas Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Global Freight, Caldwell Maritime's largest and most aggressive competitor in the North Atlantic. Sterling was a ruthless, old-school shipping magnate who had spent the last decade trying to buy Evelyn out, furious that a woman half his age was outmaneuvering him in the European markets. It wasn't just embezzlement, Evelyn whispered, the sheer scale of the malice dawning on her. It was corporate sabotage, a hostile takeover from the inside out. Exactly, Arthur said, leaning against her desk. Sterling bribed Grayson Langdon to invent the fuel deficit. They systematically drained your liquid capital to force you into Chapter 11. Once you declared bankruptcy, your assets would be liquidated. Sterling Global Freight was perfectly positioned to buy your entire fleet for pennies on the dollar at the bankruptcy auction. Grayson gets to keep a $50 million cut in the Caymans, and Sterling absorbs your empire. Evelyn stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked out at the glittering Chicago skyline, her reflection superimposed over the city lights. She had been played. She had been brought to the absolute brink of destruction by the men she trusted, orchestrated by a rival who thought she was too weak to see the knife coming. She felt the familiar sting of tears, but this time they were not born of defeat. They were born of absolute, unadulterated rage. She turned back to Arthur. "Do we have enough to prove it in federal court?" "We have the digital footprint," Arthur said, "but Sterling has the best lawyers in the world. They'll claim the Swiss account is a blind trust, that he had no knowledge of the Cayman transfers. To nail him to the wall, to get the DOJ to freeze his assets and return your $400 million, we need a confession. We need Grayson Langdon to flip on him." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Grayson is sitting in federal holding, refusing to speak to anyone but his attorney. He thinks Sterling will protect him. "Then we need to make him realize," Arthur said softly, "that Sterling is going to feed him to the wolves." Evelyn smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "Get your coat, Arthur. We are going to pay our former CFO a visit." The Federal Detention Center in downtown Chicago was a bleak, sterile fortress of concrete and fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the luxurious penthouses Grayson Langdon was accustomed to. He sat in the cramped interrogation room, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands trembling as he stared at the metal table. When the heavy steel door clanked open, he expected his high-priced defense attorney. Instead, Evelyn Caldwell and Arthur Hayes walked in. Grayson scoffed, trying to muster his old corporate arrogance. "You shouldn't be here, Evelyn. My lawyer will have a field day with this." He glared at Arthur. "And you brought the janitor. How touching." "Arthur is my new chief risk officer," Evelyn said, pulling out a metal chair and sitting directly across from Grayson. "And I'm here because I am the only person left on Earth who can save you from spending the rest of your natural life in a maximum security penitentiary." "I have nothing to say to you," Grayson sneered. "I'm pleading the fifth." Arthur stepped forward and tossed a single sheet of paper onto the metal table. It was a printed screenshot of an encrypted email recovered from the deepest archives of Grayson's deleted files. "We know about Thomas Sterling, Grayson," Arthur said calmly. Grayson's breath hitched, his eyes darting to the paper. His arrogant facade cracked instantly. "We traced the money," Arthur continued, his voice relentless. "From Nassau Maritime to Cyprus to the Deutsche Bank account in Zurich, controlled by Sterling's holding company. We have the entire map. The FBI is currently drafting the warrants." "Sterling promised to protect you, didn't he?" Evelyn said, leaning in, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "He told you that if you got caught, his lawyers would cover you. He told you the Cayman accounts were untraceable. He lied." She pulled out a second document, a freshly printed press release. "This hit the wire 10 minutes ago," Evelyn said, sliding it across the table. Grayson read it, his face draining of all blood. It was a statement from Sterling Global Freight. It vehemently denied any connection to the financial irregularities at Caldwell Maritime, claiming they had just discovered their systems had been compromised by a rogue financial contractor. "He's burning you, Grayson," Evelyn whispered. "He's going to claim you hacked his Swiss accounts to hide the money you stole from me. He's setting you up to take the fall for the entire billion-dollar deficit. He walks away, and you die in prison." Grayson began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, the reality of his betrayal crashing down on him. He had played a dangerous game of thrones with billionaires, and he had been discarded like a pawn. "What? What do you want?" Grayson choked out, tears of genuine panic streaming down his face. "I want you to testify," Evelyn demanded, her voice like steel. I want you to give the FBI the encryption keys to your private communications with Sterling. I want you to detail every meeting, every wire transfer, every bribe. You hand me Thomas Sterling on a silver platter, and I will personally ask the federal prosecutor to recommend a reduced sentence in a minimum security facility. You refuse, and I will make sure they bury you under the jail. Grayson looked at Evelyn, then at Arthur. He saw no mercy in their eyes, only justice. Okay, Grayson sobbed, burying his face in his hands. Okay, I'll give you everything. 3 days later, the financial world shifted on its axis. The FBI raided the corporate headquarters of Sterling Global Freight in New York. Thomas Sterling was arrested on the tarmac of JFK Airport, attempting to board his private Gulfstream jet to a non-extradition country in South America. The digital evidence Arthur had compiled, combined with Grayson Langdon's explosive testimony, was an insurmountable mountain of guilt. The Department of Justice immediately froze Sterling's assets, including the $420 million stolen from Caldwell Maritime. The funds were repatriated within a week. Evelyn Caldwell convened an emergency meeting of her board of directors. They sat around the same mahogany table where, just a week prior, they had demanded her surrender. Now, they looked at her with a mixture of awe and terror. The deficit is erased, Evelyn announced to the silent room, her voice echoing with absolute authority. The fleet is fully operational. Our credit lines have been restored by Chase and Goldman Sachs. Sterling Global Freight is currently under federal receivership, and I have instructed our acquisitions team to prepare a hostile buyout of their European assets. We are not bankrupt. We are going to war. The board erupted into applause, but Evelyn raised a hand, silencing them. There is one more matter, she said. She turned toward the back of the room. Arthur Hayes walked forward. He was no longer wearing a stained gray uniform. He wore a sharply tailored, midnight blue Armani suit. He carried a leather briefcase, his posture straight, his eyes bright, with renewed purpose. I would like to formally introduce our new Chief Risk Officer, Mr. Arthur Hayes, Evelyn said. Without him, this company would not exist today. His word is my word. If he tells you a number is wrong, you listen to him. The board members, the very men who had laughed at him a week ago, stood up and shook his hand. Arthur smiled politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Fast forward 1 year. The sun shone brightly through the massive windows of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Pediatric Oncology Wing. Arthur sat in a comfortable chair, holding a cup of decent coffee, watching the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. His son, Leo, was running down the hallway. The boy was thin, and his hair was still growing back in soft patches, but his cheeks were flushed with color, and his laughter echoed off the sterile walls. The bone marrow transplant had been a complete success. The leukemia was in deep, undeniable remission. Evelyn Caldwell sat next to Arthur, dressed in a casual cashmere sweater, holding a balloon shaped like a pirate ship. She watched Leo tackle a nurse with a hug. He's got energy, Evelyn noted, a genuine, warm smile on her face. He's a fighter, Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Evelyn, the billionaire CEO who had become his fiercest ally and closest friend. Thank you for everything. You don't owe me a thing, Arthur, Evelyn said quietly, her eyes fixed on the boy. You saved my life's work. I just made sure you got to keep yours. Arthur looked down at his expensive watch. He didn't have to clean floors tonight. He didn't have to hide from debt collectors. He just had to take his healthy son home, read him a bedtime story, and wake up tomorrow to run a billion-dollar empire. Sometimes, the universe rolls the dice and takes everything away. But sometimes, in the darkest, most desperate hours, you look at the board, find the missing number, and take it all back. What a story of resilience, intellect, and the unpredictable turns of fate. Arthur's journey from a heartbroken, struggling father to the savior of a billion-dollar empire proves that brilliance doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the people society overlooks the most are the ones holding the very answers the powerful are desperate to find. Evelyn's willingness to listen to the invisible man didn't just save her legacy, it saved a little boy's life. If this dramatic tale of corporate sabotage, redemption, and a father's unstoppable love kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant underdog story, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on more incredible, real-life inspired stories just like this one. Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Arthur's shoes?